And the next speaker is Natasha Abrams from UC Berkeley. And she's going to talk about assessing the impact of binary systems on microlensing using spicy and popsicle population simulations.
All right, can you hear me? Great. So hi everyone, I'm Natasha Abrams. I'm a grad student at UC Berkeley, and I'll be talking about assessing the impact of binaries on microlensing. So beyond a lot of what, the exoplanet microlensing that we've heard about for most of the conference, microlensing has the power to probe lots of other things about the galaxy. Once we've been able to observe a population of stars with microlensing, we're able to start probing stuff such as the initial mass function in the galaxy. We can also look at dark populations. We've heard a lot about free-floating planets today, or black holes, and potentially primordial black holes with microlensing. It could also reveal other galactic properties, such as the initial final mass relation, the relation from stars to compact objects, and other galactic structure things, such as distances and proper motions. And so binaries are critical, both for modeling individual events and also for statistically interpreting a distribution of events that we'll definitely find. So just going through some geometries. So PSPL stands for point source, point lens, and that's when you have a single source and a single lens. PSBL is point source binary lens when the binary acts as a lens. And binary source point lens is when the binary acts as the source. And you can also have BSBL when it acts as both. And you can have lots of different kinds of light curves. These are just some sketches. But some binary microlensing events can actually masquerade as single lenses. So in the top here, we have a typical single lens point source, point lens event. On the right, we have an obvious binary with multiple peaks. You can also have some that are ambiguous binary lenses. Some asymmetry, maybe that's parallax, maybe it's binary signal. And unless you do extensive modeling, it can be difficult to tell the two apart. So we'll simulate a mock microlensing survey, including binaries, using Popsicle to probe how binaries affect this interpretation. So Popsicle is a population synthesis code originally written by Casey, who you just heard from. It starts out with Galaxia, which simulates the Milky Way with single stars only, with the underlying Besançon model of the galaxy. We then use SPICY, which simulates single age and single metallicity clusters, to inject compact objects and binary companions into the survey with the positions and velocities found from Galaxia. You could actually then take the population there, use it as a galactic model, do any sort of science that you'd like. But we'll go on and do a mock microlensing survey and simulate binary light curves to make further observational cuts. So we find that more than half of the stellar and compact object microlensing events have at least one binary in the simulation, either as binary lens, binary source, or both. The next obvious question is what fraction of these can potentially masquerade as point source, point lens events? And so we'll do that on the first order by looking at what fraction of the events are single peaked. And we see that about 52% can potentially appear as singles. About 3% are multi-peak multiples, which is in somewhat agreement with the 3 to 10% of binary microlensing that we approximate today. And so those values were specifically for simulated ground-based observations, but with some preliminary analysis of Roman-based observations, the results are comparable. So here's a zoo of lots of the simulated light curves, where in the top we have PSPL light curves. Down here we have multi-peaked binaries. And on the right, there's binaries with one observable peak. Some maybe have a little bit of asymmetry, or some have a second peak that's below our detection threshold, but a lot really look like PSPL events. We find also that a higher fraction of the binary or lens events are multi-peaked. So these are bar graphs where the blue is single-peaked, the orange are multi-peaked. On the left, we have them each as their individual percentage, and on the right, we normalize by each category. And you can see for the PSPL, the point source binary lens category, that 18% are multi-peaked, where there's a much lower fraction in other categories. And so lots of microlensers have asked, where are the binary sources? Well, perhaps they're in plain sight, and we just have been mistaking them for PSPL events. So it also brings a TE distribution into better agreement with the data. So this is data from Ogle Telescope, ground-based survey. It's a distribution of TE. This orange is singles only. And the blue are singles and multiples. And you can see that it matches the peak a little better and a little better at the high TE end. This is also the mean TEs, average across 18 fields. And you can see that it matches better when we include the multiples. So we can also look at the binary parameter bias with microlensing. So when we measure a binary microlensing event, if by virtue of it being microlensed, has it our parameters been biased? And on the left, we can look at the semi-major axis. On the bottom, you can look at the multi-peaked events. So these are the ones that are more likely to be identified as binaries. So the blue is the pre-microlensing population, orange is post-microlensing, and green are post-microlensing lenses, and green are the post-microlensing sources. And you can see that in the lens case, we're biased away both from small and large semi-major axes. The green, we're biased away from the large semi-major axes, so that's the sources. And in the top, you can look at all systems, and you can see that for the lens companions, we're still biased away from the large semi-major axes. And in the sources, we're biased slightly towards the large semi-major axes. You can also look at the Q distributions on the right and see that there's no significant difference between the pre and post microlensing populations. So as Casey's been talking about, we are interested in selecting black holes for follow-up, currently with the for astrometric follow-up. And so we do that by looking in this pi-e-t space, where again, pi-e is the microlensing parallax and is inversely proportional to the square root of the mass of the lens, and t is proportional to the square root of the mass of the lens. So then the black holes end up in this lower part of the parameter space, these red squares. On the left, these are the singles only. On the right, those are the singles and multiples. And you can see they're still relatively isolated in this parameter space, even with the binaries. So potentially, if we are able to, with Roman, so potentially we would want to follow these black holes up in between. Either Roman could look in the seasonal gaps to potentially help characterize those quantities. And we might want to follow those up further and therefore still be able to select them. It could also, if Roman were able to look in the seasonal gaps, perhaps reveal signatures of binarity that are longer term. It could also characterize longer duration astrometric signals. So we can also look at the astrometric signals of these binaries. So in the bottom here, you can see a typical PSPL event. On the left is a light curve, and the right is the astrometric signal, where again, the photometric signal is, as the lens passes in front of the source, your source appears to get brighter and dimmer. And then the astrometric signal is as the lens passes in front of the source, as the light gets bent around the lens, it appears to wiggle a little bit. And so when we subtract out the proper motion, you get something like this ovular shape is typical. But then we can also look at the binary lens up at the top. And so it's a pretty relatively PSPL looking light curve. But if you look in the astrometric signal, you can see a significant deviation from the PSPL. And so as the if Roman is able to, release the simultaneous photometry and astrometry relatively early on, we could start to be able to distinguish between these. And if we're looking for black hole candidates to follow up, we don't want to accidentally mistake, two lenses that are massive together as one more massive object. Looking at the astrometry could really help. So, what's next? So currently we're actually been fitting all the binaries with PSPL light curves, or with models, both with and without parallax. We want to see how the parameters are biased. If we've been fitting lots of binary events with PSPL light curves, how have we been getting things right or wrong about the parameters? We also want to include binary interactions. So at the moment, there's no common envelope evolution, mass exchange, or binary disruption. So all of our black holes end up in binaries. And so this summer, we just had an undergrad at Shambhavi start on implementing cosmic into Popsicle to potentially include that binary evolution. We also want to include binary orbital motion, both in the lens and in the source. And so we've generated the parameters, and another undergrad, Dex Badra, has been working on adding binary orbital models to Bagel, our microlensing model code, and then plugging those in, the parameters in from Popsicle, so that we could have a set of light curves that include orbital motion. We also, at the moment, include triples in a rudimentary way, but we'd like to include them in higher order systems in a more robust one. So as we're going to enter this era of Roman with lots of microlensing events detected, both with photometry and astrometry, we need to remember that both when analyzing the individual events and when interpreting the entire population, the binaries are important. We found that over half of the microlensing events have at least one binary system, which could appear as single lens. The inclusion of the binaries brings the TE into better agreement with the data. And binary lenses with single peak light curves might have a strong binary astrometric signal that could potentially distinguish them better from PSPL events. Thank you.
There's a question there.
Okay. So I'm interested in the effect of the parallax, as you said, and also interested in whether the weak binary signal may mimic the parallax signal, and how they may affect the results.
Yeah, for sure. So when if I go back to the, so you can see in the PSPL, that is one event out of all of them that had multi-peaked from the parallax signal. So it's possible for there to be that confusion. As I mentioned, we're currently going through and modeling to see how much of the parallax signal could be, or how much of the microlensing signal could be eaten up by like modeling it with the PSPL with parallax. So I don't have like, this fraction at the moment, but yeah, it's definitely something that is possible to, it's possible, though, of course, there's that annularity of the parallax signal as opposed to the binary signal. So yeah, it's not entirely clear yet, and we're figuring it out.
We have a question here.
Hi, this is really cool work. I was wondering, so I think we're also expecting to find of order 1 million eclipsing binaries. So I'm wondering if you've thought about how to take the microlensing binary events you find with the eclipsing events into like a single population model.
Yeah, that would be super awesome. So a lot of the time when, well, I guess, okay, there's two things. One thing that we have sometimes thought about are what if one of those were, like an eclipsing binary were to be microlensed? And that's something that I think we're not entirely prepared for, because a lot of the time when we look for photometric microlensing surveys, we require that the baseline is static, right? Because otherwise there's just so many other types of so many other types of variability that could masquerade as microlensing. So that's something that's definitely, I think, on a lot of people's minds. And then, with regard to, combining, so this is, the binaries that we injected into this are based on like the properties, the semi-major axis, like the ellipticity, stuff like this, were based on observed binary, like the observed binary populations, which included, RBs, eclipsing binaries, all that jazz. And so in principle, I think it would be, great to like interface the two. Yeah.
Time for a last quick question. If not, thank you again, Natasha. Thank you.